The gradient background in the MR physical sky environment looks pretty good, but eventually we're going to want to replace that with our own background. And we can also use that background to illuminate the scene using image-based lighting. If we want to keep the MR sun and sky system intact, but just replace the background here, we can do that. Let's go into the material editor and double click on the MR physical sky node to load it into the parameters. And you can see we have use custom background map. If we enable that and drop in a spherical environment, then that will override the MR physical sky background. But it will not change the lighting. All it will do is replace that background. So in fact, what I really want to do here is replace the background and also drive the lighting with that background. So let's do some image-based lighting instead. Close the material editor, go into rendering environment. And we've got MR physical sky as our environment map. Let's clear that out. Right click and choose clear. And then when the button says none, click on it again. In the material map browser that comes up, double click on bitmap. And then in our current project scene assets images, choose ENV Desert Mesas 8192 by 4096.exr. And that is a spherical projection. Click on open, and we get another dialog popping up, which is the Open EXR configuration. We have the option to color correct at this stage, but we're not really going to do that in this case. We're just going to leave this alone. Notice, by the way, that the format of this EXR file is a half float, 16 bits per channel. That saves disk space. We're still storing the full dynamic range, but it's just not quite as accurate, but you won't be able to tell the difference in your renderings. So click OK to close the OpenEXR configuration dialog, and it'll take a moment to load in. Once it does, we can see it listed over here in our environment map. Now we don't see it in the viewport here, and unfortunately we can't see the environment and the lighting in this viewport at the same time. So I'll have to go over here to the shading modes where it says user defined and just set that to standard. And now we can see our background. But due to a quirk in 3ds Max, the background is actually reversed. It's flipped horizontally. And the background here actually corresponds to this terrain pretty closely. So I can tell just by looking that there's something wrong here. Let's go back into our material editor and drag this new environment map, the bitmap, over into the material editor view and choose instance. Double click on that bitmap node to load it into the material parameters, and we'll reverse it. Set the U tiling value to -1. And we can see here this looks different now. So if we set it back to 1 or -1, we can see how it's flipping. And in fact, this geometry here is obscuring the background, but the background is almost exactly the same as that geometry. We can see that just by detouring really quickly. If I select that terrain, right-click and go to Object Properties, and in the Display Properties, turn off by layer and enable See-Through, and click OK. And now we can see that there is a bitmap behind that pretty closely corresponds. It's not exactly the same elevation. I've increased the elevation a little bit here on that geometry. Okay, so I know now that my environment is lined up correctly to correspond to the lighting in the scene and also to the terrain in the scene. Okay, we don't need that terrain to be see-through anymore. I can right-click and go back into Object Properties and disable see-through. Back in our bitmap parameters, pretty importantly, we want to turn filtering off. This is a pre-filtering on textures so that when they land on objects, they won't be aliased. But if we apply filtering to our background, it's going to come out fuzzy. We want the filtering to be off, so choose none. And finally, it needs to be a lot brighter. If I render this right now, we won't get anything in the background. The image needs to be very bright in order to show up on the screen because we have a high exposure value of 13. We've stopped down. We're letting in very little light. So to compensate for that, in the bitmap parameters at the bottom, open up Output and increase the output amount. And I've experimented with this, so I know that it should be a value of 37. And press Enter. All right, we've got our background set up. We can close the material editor, and we can close environment and effects. Go into the render setup. And I just want to mention in passing that if you're using the indirect diffuse GI, if this is enabled, then you do not need to use a skylight at all. And in fact, this algorithm ignores the skylight completely. So if you just turn on GI here and you have an environment that's bright enough, you're done. You've got your skylight. But if you're using Final Gathering, which I am in this case, then I do need to have a skylight and it needs to be enabled. All right, I've got Final Gathering enabled, and I previously optimized the settings for exterior daylight. And now let's go back into our daylight system. Once again, press the H key on the keyboard. And in the Select from Scene dialog, open up Compass 001 and double-click on Daylight 001. And go to the Modify panel. And we just want to make sure that we have the correct type of skylight. Because right now we're still using MR Sky. So let's switch that over to Standard Skylight. It just says Skylight. There's nothing else there. Once we've done that, we have a new skylight parameters rollout here. And the default is a white sky color. Now we could map that. We'll play around with that in a little bit, but right now let's just enable Use Scene Environment. And then the lighting will be derived from the same image that's providing the background. And with all those settings having been made, we can go ahead and click Render Production. In our rendering, we can see that we've got a really nice crisp look to our background image. And the lighting looks really good as well. It pretty closely matches what we had with MR Sky. The only thing we lost in the process was our atmosphere and haze. But we can add that later with environment fog. And that's how to set up image-based lighting with a skylight.